Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
hmm
Today we're going to be taking a look at something that's pretty huge. Actually, it's a story that has potential repercussions all over the globe,
Yeah.
and it's about this battle that's brewing between Apple and the UK government,
Hmm.
and the UK's demand that Apple installs a backdoor into iCloud data.
Yeah, this is really fascinating, and especially because Apple's decided to go to court to fight this.
Right.
And this isn't just about, one company or one country. This is about setting a precedent
Yeah.
for how governments interact with tech companies when it
Uh,
comes to things like encryption and user data.
It's a really, really
Yeah.
big deal. So to kind of set the stage here, can you give us just like a real quick rundown of what exactly the UK is asking for and why Apple is so against it?
Yeah, so the UK government wants to be able to get access to iCloud data for their investigations, particularly ones that involve terrorism and child exploitation.
Okay.
They're using what's called the Investigatory Powers Act. It's also been called the Snoopers Charter by some, and it gives them pretty broad surveillance powers.
So Apple is kind of known for being really strong on user privacy, right?
Right.
They've, I mean, didn't they have like a big showdown a few years ago with the US government over something similar?
Absolutely. They did back in 2016. Apple refused to unlock an iPhone that belonged to a shooter.
Uh-huh.
And their argument was that creating a backdoor, even for a seemingly good cause, like,
Yeah.
catching a criminal,
Yeah.
it sets this really dangerous precedent.
Right.
Their position has always been that any backdoor weakens the security for everybody
Yeah.
and makes users more vulnerable to hackers and people who want to do bad things.
So they're basically sticking to their guns.
Yeah.
Even though the UK government's kind of coming down on them pretty hard here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it gets even more interesting when you think about the global reaction to this. Even the U.S. government has criticized the U.K. for doing this.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah.
So the US is on Apple's side now. That's a surprise. Why would they do that?
Well, it seems like the U.S. is worried that the U.K. might actually be violating the Cloud Act, which is an agreement that governs how countries share data across borders.
Gotcha.
And their concern is that what the UK is doing could mess up the balance that the Clean Act has tried to create,
Yeah.
and that could potentially make it harder for countries to work together on data sharing in the future.
So it sounds like this isn't just a fight between Apple and the UK. It's got a lot of international implications, too.
Exactly. And that's what makes this court case so important.
Yeah.
Because whatever happens could end up having a domino effect on encryption policies all over the world.
Okay, so let's say the UK wins this thing.
Right.
Paint me a picture of what that digital landscape might look like.
Well, if the UK wins, it could give other governments the idea that they can push for similar backdoors into tech products.
Yeah.
And that could ultimately lead to a weakening of encryption standards everywhere.
Right.
And so you can imagine a world where governments have routine access to everyone's encrypted data.
Okay.
And that would be a really big shift in the balance of power between governments and individuals, with some pretty big potential consequences for our privacy and cybersecurity.
That's a little scary to think about.
Yeah.
But what if Apple wins? Could this be a win for people who care about digital privacy all around the world?
It could be a huge win for privacy. If Apple wins,
Yeah.
it could set a really strong example for other tech companies who are facing this kind of pressure from their own governments.
Right.
And it would reinforce this idea that strong encryption is vital and that governments can't just force companies to make their products less secure.
So this is like a potential turning point.
Yeah.
This case could really determine what happens to encryption and digital privacy in the future.
Absolutely, it could. But there's also this whole other aspect to this, which is the UK law's gag order provision,
Okay.
which means that if Apple loses and they're forced to install a backdoor, they might not even be allowed to tell their users about it.
Oh, wow. So our data could be compromised and we wouldn't even know it.
That's the concern.
Yeah.
That adds a whole other layer of worry to this.
It does. It really does. It seems like this whole thing is about more than just technology. It's about basic rights and transparency. And who really have the power in a digital world?
Exactly. And it really highlights how important it is to pay attention to these developments and to have informed discussions about the kind of digital future that we want to create.
Okay, so we've established that the stakes are really high here and that this case could have a global impact. But what about Apple's chances of actually winning this legal battle? What do you think?
Well, Apple's legal strategy is pretty interesting. They're not just arguing that it's technically impossible to make a backdoor that's truly safe.
Right.
They're also raising concerns about the impact this could have on basic human rights, like freedom of expression and privacy.
Oh, wow. So they're really fighting this on multiple fronts. It's not just about the technical stuff.
Exactly. They're framing this as a battle for fundamental freedoms in the digital age.
Right.
And that's a message that could really resonate with the court and the public.
It sounds like they've got a pretty strong case going.
Yeah.
But let's dig a little deeper into those legal arguments.
Mm.
What are some of the key points that Apple's making in court?
Well, one of their main points is this idea that it's basically impossible to create a backdoor that's actually secure.
Right.
They're saying that any backdoor, no matter how good the intentions are behind it,
Yeah.
is going to weaken security and create vulnerabilities that hackers and bad actors could exploit.
So it's like having a master key that can unlock any door.
Exactly. It defeats the whole purpose of having locks in the first place.
Right. Okay.
Apple's also arguing that the UK government hasn't really shown that they actually need this backdoor.
Okay.
They're claiming that the UK already has legal tools and ways to cooperate with tech companies to get the data they need for legitimate investigations.
So they're saying the UK is asking for a sledgehammer when they've already got a perfectly good toolbox.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And they're also challenging the whole scope of the UK's Investigatory Powers Act. They're saying that it's way too broad and that it actually infringes on people's fundamental rights to privacy and freedom of expression.
So Apple's making this a human rights issue.
Right.
It's not just about technical security anymore.
Exactly. They're saying that people need to be able to communicate securely if they're going to express themselves freely without being afraid of being watched or censored.
That's a really interesting angle. It takes this debate way beyond just the technical aspects of encryption
Yeah.
and turns it into this bigger conversation about like the balance between security and privacy and freedom in a digital society.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that Apple's position on this has actually gotten a lot of support from privacy advocates and even some other governments around the world.
Oh, wow. So they're not alone in this.
Yeah.
There are other people who see the importance of strong encryption and the dangers of governments having too much power.
Right. And that global support could really help Apple. It gives more weight to their argument that this isn't just about one company or one country.
Yeah.
It's about setting a precedent that could have consequences for everyone.
Okay, so we've got this big legal battle going on. Apple's making some pretty strong arguments. But let's be real here. They're going up against a powerful government. What do you think their chances are of actually winning this thing?
It's really hard to say for sure. The UK legal system is complicated.
Yeah.
And the outcome could depend on a lot of different things, like what specific evidence is presented and how the court interprets the laws that already exist.
So it's kind of uncharted territory here.
In a way, yeah. But even if Apple doesn't win completely, this case could still have a big impact on the future of encryption and data privacy.
So even if they lose, could it still be a catalyst for some kind of change?
Absolutely. This whole legal battle is already raising awareness about how important encryption is.
Right.
And about the potential dangers of governments having too much access to our data.
Oh.
It's starting a public debate. And it's forcing policymakers to really think about these issues.
So regardless of who wins or loses, this case is forcing us to confront some really big questions about the balance of power in a digital society.
Exactly. And it shows how important it is for people to get involved and make their voices heard.
Okay, so while we're waiting to see what the court decides, what are some key things we should be paying attention to as this case unfolds?
Well, keep an eye on how the arguments change over time and how the court interprets the laws that deal with privacy, security, and the government's ability to access data.
Right.
This case could set some really important legal precedents that could shape the future of encryption, not just in the UK, but maybe even globally.
There's a legal drama with some real-world consequences. We need to stay informed and engaged.
Definitely. And don't just rely on headlines or sound bites. Dig deeper into the arguments, look at the evidence, and really think about what the implications could be. This is a complicated issue, and there are no easy answers.
I agree. We need to be informed citizens, not just people who blindly use technology. Okay, so we've covered the legal battle, the possible outcomes, and the bigger picture of what all of this means. But I want to shift gears for a minute and talk about something that I think sometimes gets lost in all of this.
Okay. What's
The human element. We talk about encryption like it's this technical problem with a technical solution, but it's really about people.
right? Yeah, I see what you mean.
It's about protecting our privacy, our freedom, our ability to talk to each other without being afraid that someone's listening.
That's a really important point. Behind all the algorithms and legal arguments, there are real people whose lives are affected by these decisions.
Exactly. Think about journalists who need to protect their sources, or activists who are organizing protests, or businesses that need to keep their data safe.
Or even just everyday people who want to talk to their families and friends without worrying about being monitored.
Right? Encryption gives people power. And if we weaken encryption, it could have a chilling effect on free speech and innovation.
It's also important to remember that the people making these decisions, the judges, the lawmakers, the tech executives, they're human beings too.
Yeah.
They have their own values and biases and experiences. They're not just robots.
So even though we need to understand the technical and legal stuff, we also need to remember that real people are at the heart of this story.
Absolutely. And we need to recognize that this isn't just a battle between Apple and the UK government. It's a reflection of this bigger tension in our society about how we balance security and privacy and the role of technology in our lives.
It's a reminder that technology isn't neutral. It's shaped by the choices that people make.
Yeah.
And those choices have consequences.
And it's up to us to make sure that technology serves humanity, not the other way around.
It really does make you think differently about it when you start thinking about encryption as like a basic human right.
It does. It
Right.
really changes the whole conversation.
It does. It makes you wonder, if it is a human right, then what are our responsibilities to protect that? Right? Like, is it up to individuals to make sure their stuff is secure online? Or do governments and these big tech companies have an obligation to provide us with secure platforms and tools?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I don't think there's an easy answer to it. It's probably a combination of both.
Yeah.
Individuals need to be aware of the risks and take steps to protect their own data. But companies and governments also need to step up and create a digital environment that's actually safe and secure for everyone.
I mean, think about all the stuff that we keep online now. Our finances, our health records, all our personal conversations.
Yeah.
If all of that isn't secure, it makes us so vulnerable to all kinds of bad things like identity theft, blackmail, even political manipulation.
Absolutely. And as technology becomes more and more a part of our lives, the stakes just keep getting higher and higher.
Yeah, it's like we've gotten so used to the convenience of it all that we don't even stop to think about the risks anymore.
That's true. We need to be having these conversations and educating ourselves about these issues and making sure that our rights are protected.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to end up in a future where we have no privacy and our freedoms are gone.
This whole case with Apple in the UK is a perfect example. It's a real wake-up call that these aren't just theoretical debates. This stuff has real consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely. And the outcome of this case could have a ripple effect all over the world. It could influence how other countries approach encryption and data access in the future.
So what can we do? What can people listening to this do to make a difference?
Well, the first thing is to stay informed. Don't just read the headlines. Dig a little deeper and try to understand the arguments on both sides of the issue.
And don't be afraid to speak up. Contact your elected officials and let them know that you care about digital privacy and security.
Yeah, and support organizations that are fighting for digital rights. Make conscious choices about the technology that you use and the companies that you do business with.
It's all about being an active participant, not just a passive consumer.
Exactly. We can shape our digital future. It's not already decided for us.
That's a good point. This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this with me.
It's been my pleasure. I've enjoyed this conversation.
To everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Keep learning, stay engaged, and let's all work together to build a digital future that protects our rights and our freedoms.